Hello and welcome to the Williams-Sonoma Fall 2021 Fall Wine Preview. I'm Mark Malpede, Vice President of Sales and Marketing at Williams-Sonoma, and with me tonight is winemaker, Director of Winemaking, Jeff Mangahaus. We
Hi,
did
guys.
not coordinate shirts intentionally. And
I'm short sleeved, so.
There you go. And Carly Dupuis. Carly is also managing our broadcast, so she has already told me she can't be as vocal as she usually is, so please, we'll give her a pass on that because she's going to keep us in the show.
Yes, sounds good.
So today we're looking at the release preview for the opening of our fall release, which is on Monday morning for most people. These are mainly the vineyard designate wines, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Zinfandel. We've chosen 10 wines to share with you tonight. And the idea is we're going to give you a preview of the vintage and try to give you some description, because we know it's so hard when you have to buy the wines before you've tried them. So, Jeff will be our main taster, and I'll do my best to support him with my less than professional commentary on it. So we encourage comments and questions. We have a couple of people monitoring the chat. We generally tend to get more than we can answer, but we do try to pick some out to answer during the course of the broadcast. We will try to keep this to an hour and end at 5 o'clock Pacific time. I already see some folks checking in from the East Coast and as well as Hawaii. So, to the gentleman in New Jersey who's still working right now and can't drink wine, it's 7 o'clock your time, man. Come on. It's time to kick off work and open a bottle. So why don't we jump right in, and Jeff will tell us a little bit about the 2019 vintage.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mark. A lot of wines to get through. Although it's kind of interesting. Yeah, I mean, obviously the vintage, the weather is super important in defining these wines. And 2019 was a pretty terrific year through and through. And I probably say that all the time because, after all, it's California, the weather, the sun shines all the time. And, we have, certainly a vintage like this with a ample rainfall, so health in the vines and that kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, overall, it was a pretty terrific vintage. I know you've seen this document or this slide before, Carly. If you got a second, show this this graphic. Kind of simplified it a tiny little bit, but this is sort of a telling story. And apologize while I kind of geek out a little bit, but this is sort of what I do in monitoring weather and as it relates to grape ripening. But if you look at the very far right column, that's the 2019 vintage, and these are actually numbers related to sort of an index that is commonly used in the wine growing sort of business as growing degree days. So it's sort of it's an average temperature between the day and daytime high and the low, but above a certain temperature, and that temperature is 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's kind of where metabolically the plants are sort of active. And so the yellow column on the side refers to the accumulation, and these are kind of just, think of them just as numbers, right? But as the yellow numbers are, the yellow column is an average of those 9. There's actually another vintage in there, but it's like 10 vintages. And so then you start looking at each of the vintages and you see how it deviates from each year. And so we know 2011, for example, was a really cool year. And you can see numerically that those were sort of below average for those daytime temperatures. It was effectively, it was a much cooler vintage. And I think those numbers kind of describe that. So then you go to the far right column with 2019, and it sort of tells the story. April was a very warm month, and that was definitely true. We had, just above average temperatures. May was a cool month. And then the rest of the season, it was just sort of moderate, a little bit cool in June, a little bit cool in July, and then slightly above average in August and September. And very similar actually to 2015. If you look at that column there and you see how it sort of mimics what happened in 2015. So I'm not saying that those are similar vintages, but they had similar weather. What's interesting, so 64%, so the bottom line, the rainfall total average for the 10 years is about 31 inches. We had over 51 inches of rain in the 2019 growing season, so plenty of water for it to sustain the plants. And as a consequence, the winter was a little cool. The bud break was a little bit later in 2019, but that 10% above average temperatures in April really kind of caught up the growing season. So we're 2 weeks late on bud break, but we caught up pretty aggressively. May is typically the flowering month. And it started out pretty good in May, but then we got really cool. But it's really interesting to me when I compare it to, say, 2015, which was also one of the coolest Mays on record. 2015 had really small, very, very poor flowering, but the flowering wasn't, even though it was cool in 2019, it wasn't, we had a pretty good set, actually. And as it turns out, I remember actually in 2019, when the cool weather set in, it was in the mid to upper 60s as opposed to, maybe even the low 70s on a few occasions, as we're in 15 where we had the very, very poor set. That vintage was more like in the low 60s, upper 50s for that cool period. So that's one of the main differences. So bottom line, 2019, was really one of the perfect growing seasons. And as a consequence, ample sunshine, good color development in the skin and good phenolic development. Sort of been the norm as of late, where we haven't had as much fog during the August months, which is sort of typical for us. 2019, we had hardly any fog. And so one of the net effects of that is that the nighttime temperatures were a little bit warmer. And so in general, I tend to think of 19 as being slightly lower in acidity, because I tend to think of the fog cooling the grapes down, slowing down the sort of the ripening process at night, and sort of the plant shutting down. And, in the cooler, foggy August, we tend to preserve a little bit more acidity. We're talking about shades of gray here in terms of that difference. But what the net effect is, I feel like the wines with their rich tannin profile, because of the nice quality of growing season, with the slightly softer acid profiles, there's a lot of generosity with the wines. So I think that's kind of one of the real hallmarks of the wine, or of the vintage. They're impressive now, but I think they still will develop nicely over the next 5 or 7 years. So yeah, with that said, let's maybe start jumping in and taste some wines. Were there any questions or comments on any of that, Mark? Well,
I think we should get into the wines. So
cool.
We're going to start off with 2 Chardonnays. There are 4 in this release. So the first one is the Allen Vineyard Chardonnay, and it is one of the more interesting Chardonnays that from the Allen Vineyard in recent times, Jeff. I tasted it as you were going over the vineyard or the vintage summary. It's the apple and the pear and the tropical fruit are really dominant in it, and it's really soft. It's got a nice, I'm not getting any not too many oak or butter notes on it. It's really just crisp and clean, and I'm getting that real bright fruit in it.
Yeah, absolutely. No, that's kind of one of the harm. I think the fruit profile that you just described is sort of typical for Allen. A little bit of green apple, the pear kind of notes. And, what I appreciate, and I think this is, we talk about Pinot Noir being really great in the Russian River Valley, but I think in select sites, Russian River Chardonnay is pretty terrific as well. In general, the cooler nighttime climates tend to, I think of it as a thicker skin, a little bit more phenols, a little more structure. Even though there's whole cluster, when we harvest Chardonnay grapes and whole cluster press them, there is contact of the skin and in the juice during the pressing process, right? And so typically I like to think of the thicker the skin, the more structure that the wine or lends itself to the wine. And I definitely get that, here there's definitely a body and a tannin structure on the back end. So that's not unusual to think about in great sites, great regions where there's Chardonnay. Both of these Chardonnays, and just as a reminder, Chardonnay for us is it's barrel fermented. It has our just natural yeast, and it undergoes a really nice, long, slow primary fermentation. Undergoes full malolactic fermentation, and we do a lot of barrel batonnage or lees stirring. To me, a hallmark of this wine is that structure, and it's definitely there in the wine.
Awesome. Hey, Scott. So our former director of hospitality just joined us. We miss you, buddy. Jeff, there was a question here that you can answer two parts, really. Someone asked about how does the acidity affect aging? And could you touch on a little bit of aging of Chardonnays? Because we really talk about aging of Pinots a lot, but we don't really discuss aging of Chardonnays all that much.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think acidity is just important in general. It's I tend to think of it as the backbone of the wine, right? The flavors, the tannin structure, all those kind of things help. It's the backbone of the wine. So fundamentally, I think it's important just for a wine for clarity, aroma and palate clarity. I think it requires acidity. As far as ageability, I think just like what I talked about earlier with the tannin structure, as the tannin structure, even in a Chardonnay, starts to come together. So we know that in red wines, as we age them, they get softer, right? And so I think as that's similarly happening, it's the same chemistry that's sort of happening in a white wine with tannin structure. So it's getting softer, and it may reach a point where the wine is too soft, and if it doesn't have enough acidity, and it's 10 or 15 years old, it's just going to kind of lose balance. So it's important, so don't forget about the tannin structure necessarily in white wines, and they do benefit from age. And then it just becomes that, where do you like it? Where does that acid tannin balance, ultimately it's personal preference, of course, but it's a similar aging process as in red wines.
Yeah. And to just another question that I can answer, we do not do whole cluster in the Chardonnays that I just saw come up. So the second Chardonnay is the Lewis MacGregor vineyard. This is in a vineyard that William Selling bought in 2014. It's on the east side of the river, just off of East Side Road. It was planted to Chardonnay and Pinot, an older clone of Chardonnay, the Wente clone of Chardonnay, primarily over there. Is it 100%, Jeff, or is it?
Yeah, it's 100% Wente over there. That's there now. We redeveloped. It had some other clonal mix, but I always favored the Wente. The Wente kind of cluster, if you ever happen to see it, is really fascinating. It's a really tiny cluster, almost the size of like a Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir clusters tend to be small, but it's very loose, and the berries are very tiny, and oftentimes they don't actually have any seeds in them. So it's just pure, a tiny little bit of juice and skin, and to me, the wine there's a hallmark sort of like spiced pear minerality about the Lewis MacGregor, and certainly related to the clone. Definitely, it's a perfect site for both Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. It has wonderful texture. It is full bodied on the palate, right? And what a different Chardonnay compared to the Allen, even though they're made in identical sort of fashion,
Yeah, you get a lot more of the, like, some herbal qualities in it that, where I think the Allen tended more to those fruit, the pear, and even a little bit of lemon in there. I get a little more of the kind of the spicy and grassiness of Chardonnay in this.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, and that's a real positive, right? It's got, sometimes to me it smells like there's hints of tarragon, like these beautiful kind of delicate herbs. For people that follow and know me, I always talk about sushi and Japanese food. Sometimes I get like shiso out of it. If you know what shiso kind of smells like, it's a very delicate, fragrant green herb that's often used in Japanese cuisine.
Nice. I want to go back to the aging question because I didn't really phrase it correctly. Do you, Jeff? One person asked, does the acidity, is the higher acidity going to minimize the aging? Similar question from someone else, was the temperature issues minimize the aging? And just to give Jeff a little break from talking, actually acidity is going to help these wines age, is really the point. And the temperature is an impact on the growing season, but it doesn't necessarily mean a cool year will age and a hot year won't, because so much comes down to the details of picking and vineyard management. That those decisions will ultimately impact the aging. So we work within what the climate is giving us that year to manage it, to make sure that these wines are ageable. Certainly some vintages age better than others. We were chatting earlier today about the 2015 vintage, which is going to be an exceptionally long lived vintage. So, and that was a moderately cool year, but it's more about the fact that it was a low yielding crop that year that is going to create that long lived nature. You want to add anything to that, Jeff, in more technical terms?
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, the flavor profile, the tannin structure, the acidity in a wine varies by vintage. So what I mean by, and I said it earlier a little bit, it's sort of shades of gray. The pH might be, 3.45 in a warmer vintage, say, for example, in the Lewis McGregor Chardonnay or whatever it is. But in a cooler vintage, it might be 3.42. You're not going to necessarily tell the difference numerically, but it might have an impact, on the perception of that wine. So the tannin structure, and kind of side note, it's not just about the acidity, it's the quality of the tannin. So Mark mentioned the 15 vintage, for example. That's an incredibly tannic vintage. Just smaller berries, lots of tannin development in the wines, and those are going to be ageable, from that perspective. So, and another good example is the coast wines. We tend to think of the Sonoma Coast as being cool, and it is, but typically the acid profiles are much lower in the Sonoma Coast than they are in the Russian River Valley. What they make up for in difference is a very high tannin concentration. And so it's not just one element of sort of the architecture of the wine that determines longevity. It's sort of the interplay of all the other components, right? Including winemaking, whether there's whole cluster and, tannins from whole clusters and things like that. So, so don't worry too much. I know I talked about that in terms of the hallmark of the vintage. These wines have acidity to them, right? It's how we pick the grapes, how we, I'm monitoring very, very closely how the development of the flavors and the acid profiles, and making my picking decisions based on that to be able to make a wine that's going to be enjoyable, young, and, if you wanted to age it, you could age it. So,
that is the great thing about Pinot Noir is, you can age our Pinot Noir at least for years, and the wine will change, and you may love it more 7 to 10 years of age. But if you drink these on release, they're still delicious wines. Now, absolutely. I personally like them in the 5 to 7 year range. Jeff and I got to host Katie Williams, Bert's daughter, today for a tasting, and we tasted a couple of Bert's wines going back to 88, and we tasted some 2014 wines. And I think right now, the 14 vintage with 7 years of age is in kind of a perfect spot. Wines show beautifully at that. But these wines that we're trying tonight, or if I take one of these home tonight, I will certainly enjoy it almost as much as I would one of the 14s. So it's degrees of difference, not huge differences.
Exactly.
We're going to move into the Pinot Noirs now, and I'm going to answer one other question as we get there. First Pinot Noir is the East Side Road Neighbors Pinot Noir. Before I give you a little bit about that wine, someone asked about the port. We are no longer making port. The 14 was the last vintage of port we made, which we released last year. Originally, when we started making port, it was our former winemaker, Bob Cabral, of Portuguese descent, wanted to do something to honor his dad. And we happened to be growing Portuguese varietals in one of our vineyards in the Central Coast. So we made a port. And then as more recently, we were having trouble locating quality spirits to fortify the port with. And since Bob had left and we were having trouble getting these spirits, we decided that 14 was going to be the last vintage. So no more port. So you won't see it on this this allocation. East Side Road Neighbors is a blend of our vineyards along the East Side Road on the east side of the Russian River. So it's some of the Foss Vineyard, some of the Caligari Vineyard, and our Lewis McGregor Vineyard. And this tends to be the sibling to our West Side Road Neighbors vineyard. I usually find this wine being a little darker fruited. You get more of, it's still dominated by, I think, red fruit flavors, but it definitely has a little bit of a darker color. And I pick up some of those, a little more of those blackberry flavor and, a little more, I wouldn't go as far as saying plum, but in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
Jeff, you want to chime in on this?
Definitely. Even though this is, really not far from West Side Road. From the winery, it's a couple miles across to East Side Road. But a lot of these vineyards are on the hilltops of East Side Road. So, Lewis McGregor, Caligari, they enjoy a lot of warmth throughout the day and the growing season. And so it's oftentimes we're starting our harvest on the East Side Road. So the soil warms up a little quicker. It's usually some of the first vineyards to bud break. And so it's usually the first vineyards that we harvest. So definitely owing to a slightly warmer microclimate. And I think it does, that translates into the wine. There's definitely some red fruit undertones, but definitely a darker fruit. If we were tasting the West Side Road Neighbors side by side, you would definitely get more of a red fruited character in West Side as opposed to East, where it's red and a little bit of black fruit in there. Very structured, kind of opulent wine. It's sort of a delicious sort of all around wine, in my opinion, because it has so many different sort of facets to it. Structure, minerality, dark fruits.
West Side Road Neighbors is often dominated by cranberry, and I feel like East Side doesn't have as much cranberry in it. That's where that black fruited comes in.
Blacker fruit, yeah.
Yeah. And I tend to, in comparison, I drink my East Side Road Neighbors a little earlier than my West Side Road Neighbors. Carly, welcome to the show.
I had to chime in on this one. I love it.
Yeah, cool.
Give us something about the East Side Road Neighbors. What are you getting in this?
This is one of my favorites from the fall release. I love the East Side. I love the West Side too. They're probably some of my favorite wines from Williams-Sonoma just because of they just feel classic to me. But what I really like about this is that kind of, you mentioned it earlier, that kind of darker fruitedness, but also the kind of florality that I get from this wine is really pretty. It reminds me of like rose bushes and cherry bark or something.
Yeah.
It's very, very pretty.
Yeah.
But also can stand up to some food.
For sure. Yeah, it's interesting. It's so the as Mark mentioned, the components are Caligari, Foss, and our McGregor estate. And if we were tasting the Caligari, and I know I've mentioned this in other tastings, that the Caligari is all about red fruits in that particular vineyard, and it has a really, I don't know, a perfume of rose petals. And so when I put my nose in this glass, I'm definitely picking out Here it's might be a little bit more like dried rose petal as opposed to the Caligari, the vineyard designate wine, where it's fresh rose petals. It's pretty remarkable. And to me, that screams Russian River Valley too, right? I mean, Pinot Noir from Russian River Valley has, in some way, shape, and form, sort of a floral character, and it can be rose petals, fresh or dried, or it could be violets or lavender or, iris, that kind of thing. It definitely, I think it's a hallmark of Russian River.
There's a savory aspect to this. I can't come up with actually what I'm tasting, but it's like a little salinity, and there's definitely some savory bit in this that I'm just loving. So it's on the mid palate. It's beautiful.
I actually was gonna comment on that too. I wouldn't quite call it like animal, but maybe like a slight kind of very subtle, very pretty iron note or something.
Yeah.
It's got like that, like you mentioned, it's a savory kind of component that really balances out the beautiful fruit on this wine.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's, these are, again, all sort of inherent traits in Pinot Noir as well, right? I mean, Pinot Noir it can have floral, it can have herbaceous notes in a positive way, fresh, herbs, that kind of thing, and earthiness kind of underlying. So this will be a fascinating one to taste it in a few years, I think. Mm-hmm. But yeah, who could resist it now, right?
Yeah. So let's move on to the next Pinot for sake of time. I'm just, it's funny. It feels in the first 5 minutes like we're going to be done by like in 15 minutes, and then suddenly a half hour is gone. So 2019 Weir Vineyard Pinot Noir. Weir Vineyard's located in the Yorkville Highlands in Mendocino County. So if you've ever driven up 128 into Mendocino, Yorkville Highlands is right as you pass over the boundary from Sonoma County into Mendocino. So it's the southern part of Mendocino County. Very hilly, windy roads, beautiful country up there.
Yeah, terrific wine. I mean, this vineyard, some of the first plantings were in 1991. So, I mean, that's pretty incredible, actually. They have some significant age, certainly by our standards. Couple of different clonal selections of Pinot Noir, and you've heard me talk about different clones in the past, but what's really important about that is that each one has a subtle different complexion. So coming together, it really brings a lot of roundness to the wine. It's definitely at elevation, a rocky kind of soil, but just a gorgeous wine with texture. I always think of Weir as texture, certainly with a little bit of age. There's minerality, there's red fruits, and it's one of the more unique wines, I think, in our portfolio, because it's just so texturally dynamic. And some of my favorite Weirs have been, you said 5 or 7 years. I've had terrific 10-year-old Weirs, and it just has that there's that underlying structure that comes together slowly. And if anybody has watching has a 10-year-old bottle of Weir, it's probably pretty spectacular right about now. So
yeah, and from a climate standpoint, given its location, does it profile more like Sonoma County? Because you get much cooler and foggier the further up you go into Mendocino. But in the southern part, is it more like Sonoma?
No, so I mean, when we get to Farrington, it's a bit of a similar story. Where the Weir Vineyard is, its fog and coastal influence is really not so much from Sonoma County and the Russian River, but from the Navarro River, which is pretty far north from the Yorkville Highlands. There's a tiny little bit, but not as much. And so because it is very far away from the entrance of the Navarro, the fog tends to burn off very quickly. So it tends to be a very warm site. But also, interestingly, if the fog doesn't come in and penetrate this vineyard as much, sort of the heat evaporates really quickly. So the nighttime temperatures can be very cold. You think of the fog as sort of an insulative layer. So it's trapping heat. Foggy regions like Russian River tend to be 52, 55 degrees. But this vineyard and at the Farrington vineyard, for example, the nighttime temperatures can be in the upper 40s. So there's a bigger difference diurnal temperature shift. So that has a pretty significant impact on how it tastes and how quickly the tannins develop and that sort of thing. It's usually one of our later vineyards, actually, because I think the nights tend to be very cool here.
Oh, that's awesome. Every time we do this, I learn something new. So that's I didn't know that about that region. So,
yeah.
But beautiful wine. I mean, long finish, great structure.
Definitely.
Definitely, as you pointed out, red fruited. Carly, since you're hanging out with us, jump in.
Oh yeah, I mean, you know me. I'm definitely a big fan of Anderson Valley. I love Anderson Valley wines, especially from Williams-Sonoma. I think that we, I guess, represent the AVA really well. That kind of, I don't know. Again, that classic feeling. I always use that word, but for me, it feels classic Anderson Valley. And it was amazing when I first tasted this. I mean, the finish on this is insane. It just lingered, and the acid that just kind of gave that mouth-watering kind of feeling.
Yeah, it's juicy. Yeah,
beautiful.
Yeah.
And so, staying in Mendocino County, we're going to move on to the Farrington. So we're moving north by, what would you say, Jeff? About 20 miles?
Not that much. Maybe 10, half as much. So yeah, here you're proper. This is sort of the entrance of the Anderson Valley. So if you're at 1,200 feet elevation at, say, Weir, you kind of wind a little bit on 128, and then you really drop down to the valley floor to get into Boonville. Similar story, as I mentioned, that diurnal temperature shift. Oftentimes I'm sampling grapes in Russian River, and then I run up to Farrington, and it's, 5 and sometimes even 10 degrees cooler up at Farrington. This is a great picture, actually. So, it's sort of in the valley floor, and it's in the foothill, up in the hills, up in the distance. That's a vineyard called Cerise that Ted Lemon used to source grapes from, and some other terrific vineyards up in the hills there. Here it's kind of, I have 6 different Pinot Noir clones. They're all fermented separately, and so that adds I think an added dimension to the wine. When I tasted this recently to do the tasting notes, this wine just wowed me. All the great things that I said about the vintage, nice, even, no heat spikes. Ripening was sort of, I don't want to say at a snail's pace, but a very even sort of pace. Super concentrated wine. I mean, this wine just blew me away. Getting your nose in there, there's definitely some, it's on the darker red fruit side, so more on kind of like the black cherry side. Typically, I find Farrington to be purely red fruited, but here there's some elements, underlying elements of dark fruit. But wow, what a concentrated wine. I mean, I don't know, what do you guys think of it?
Oh yeah, it's definitely, it kind of caught me by surprise when I tasted it. I'm a big fan of the Farrington vineyard. Not only from Williams-Sonoma, it's one of my favorite vineyards in general. I love that a lot of other vineyards source from this, or a lot of other producers source from this vineyard, and it's always really neat to see each expression of this terroir. But I was really, this is the first time I'm tasting the 2019, which is very exciting. And I definitely was amazed at just how, I don't know, intense it is, I guess, but it's still so elegant and beautiful. And it has all these different kind of, I think you use the word concentrated. I think that's definitely a good way to put it. You get Absolutely. Like the citrus notes and the, bright
citrus,
fruit, and that beautiful salinity, that beautiful minerality. It's kind of, what I would consider a perfect package.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's very bright and refreshing on the palate, and that's one of the hallmarks, I think, owing to those really cold temperatures at night, where I think here the acidity is typically very well preserved. And so, this wine finishes so, even though it's so concentrated, it has it finishes very clean and refreshing on the palate because it has, to geek out a little bit, I mean, it has a very low pH, and that's sort of natural for Farrington, regardless of what the growing season's like. Super 3, 4, 5 pH, yeah. So, which is, arguably, I mean, it's a terrific number numerically because the wine stays fresh and, microbially stable, all those kinds of things, but it also gives that freshness to the palate.
Yeah, this it doesn't taste. Sorry, I'm stumbling here. It's an unexpected Farrington for me. I find the Farrington usually to be a little more brambly and a little darker. And so either my memory is terrible, which is arguably possible, or this to me is it seems like a different expression of Farrington than I'm used to. Am I off base here, Jeff?
No, I don't think so. I mean, maybe a little bit because I think it has some classical elements to Farrington. It just, yields were modest. I pick out the red. There's, some red fruited characters to it. It's missing a little bit of the cranberry notes that I typically get out of it. I don't often find it to be brambly per se. I tend to find it to be more in that red fruited category. But here it offers a little bit of both. So it is sort of surprising in a way, but I think a really pleasant surprise in my opinion.
All right, well, we're going to keep going up 128 towards Philo now. And I'm not exactly sure of this location, Jeff. So
I can definitely. This is the 2019 Savoy Vineyard Pinot Noir. This is one of the newest, or the newest, I guess, addition to the Pinot Noir portfolio at Williams-Sonoma. What a terrific vineyard! So this vineyard similarly dates back to the early 90s. It was planted by namesake Rich Savoy, who happened to be getting some of the history about him. He started up this for those San Francisco diehards, the Green Apple books in San Francisco. It's a bit of a fixture for independent books and things like that. So he started that, and in the early 80s, wanted to farmstead up in the Anderson Valley, and spent some time in Boonville, but then found this property way up valley. So we're definitely traveling north up 128. So there's more fog influence. For those that have been up there, it's pretty much near Hendy Woods, up in that part of Anderson Valley, Philo area. And it's sort of an interesting part of the valley because it sort of narrows down a little bit. If anybody's spent any time there, it's sort of a rather expansive valley. But in this part of the of Anderson Valley, it's a little more narrow. So the wind does sort of channel through here, and it tends to be a little bit more of a windy site, a cooler site. One of the first vineyards to have planted multiple clones and different experimental, blocks and that kind of thing. Lots of different soil types here. And this happens to be the Williams-Sonoma Savoy has three clones. Martini, which is an heirloom California clone, very thick skin, very phenolic in a positive way. There's Pommard, which is, that's a classic. That's a Bert sort of favorite and a Jeff favorite as well. And there's a little bit of 115, which is a Dijon clone, which is sort of normal in that part of the world because it is cool. Interestingly enough, I find when I put my nose in the glass here, it's dark cherry, it's black cherry. Often, I don't know what the tasting note says, Carly, but like Morello cherry, that kind of thing. It's to me, it's sort of a classic, that part of the Anderson Valley wine. Blueberry is another common one. In the vine rows, it's fascinating in this part of the world. There's this pennyroyal that grows, which is sort of it smells like a wild mint or oregano or something like that, and it's ubiquitous in the environment, and it's definitely in the vine rows, and that somehow gets picked up in the wine, right? I mean, that's part of the terroir in a way, and that becomes sort of has a supporting role in the wine, and I definitely get sort of a minty sort of element about it. Do you guys get that part of it? It's classic, I think.
Yeah. I was going to ask what the heck is pennyroyal. So thank you for beating me to the punch, because I've heard the word before, but I don't know what it is.
Yeah.
The definitely, calling it minty does the wine a disservice, but because it definitely isn't minty. I would see that as a negative, but it's got this flavor that is reminiscent of mint. I don't know how to describe it. It's just this little hint that you go, oh, what is that? Kind of like in the other one where you're saying tarragon. I'm like, okay, I'm getting herbal, so I can see tarragon tarragon in this. When you say minty, I'm like, I know what you're talking about. I can taste it. I just can't describe it quite as well. So pennyroyal, I'm going to have to put that into my.
I'll bring some back for you next time I'm up there, so you can smell it directly.
Yeah, awesome.
But, and just another sort of hallmark to me when I put it in the mouth. It's got a beautiful texture, but the finish is usually quite unique to me. It's sort of it's probably in the tasting note too, but it's to me it's always there, that sort of cherry stone, like high cherry season, you're eating these black cherries, and you get to the pit, and there's a sensation to it, right? It's a phenol, it's a structural element, and to me it just has that beautiful closure. It gives that closure to the wine, and that's what the Savoy Pinot Noir is about. It's got all those elements.
Awesome inaugural effort. So this is our newest Pinot Noir, but it will be on the allocation for the future years as far as we know. So now jumping to the next one, I think many of us find the Allen Vineyard to be our favorite vineyard year in and year out. Right up the road from where we're located on the winery on West Side Road. In 2019, we were still getting a mix of the very old vines planted in the 60s, as well as some of the newer vines up on the hillside. Generally, I find the Allen Vineyard to produce a wine that is our prettiest wine, and also one of the most ageable wines we make, I think. Mm-hmm. Year in and year out, it's in my top three. Even if the other two rotate in and out, Allen is always one of my favorites. It's one of the wines I always try to buy in Magnum and try to put down for years. It's a beautiful wine, and I cannot wait to try the 19 vintage of this.
Yeah.
Carly, have you had a chance to taste it?
Yeah.
I just tasted it. First time trying it. It's beautiful. I also have to agree with you with the ageability on this wine. We've, of course, Mark, we've been fortunate enough to have a few bottles here and there of library vintages of Allen for various celebratory purposes over the past couple of years. And I was completely blown away by just how ageable this wine was. I think we had something from the 90s or 80s that was just spectacular. But it's also, again, like you said earlier, with these wines tasting so beautiful young as well, I'm very happy drinking this.
Yeah. There's almost something, oftentimes it describes, certainly with a little bit of age. I mean, Allen can be very ethereal, right? It's so put together, you can't really identify specific things about it. It's up on the hillside, has this wonderful sort of gravelly kind of soil. Yeah, and it's definitely never the most boisterous wine, right? And right across the street is Rocchioli, which can definitely be a big, sort of burly, much more dense wine. But both wines can age very well, for sure. And it owes to the thinner soils, the gravel, more gravel in the soil up at Allen. And to me, it always develops these wonderful mineral sort of complexion in the palate, which does sort of enable, it's a tannin structure. It's something that comes together very slowly and very elegantly. Beautiful perfume. To me, Allen's always about perfume. And it's always sort of red fruited, and I definitely get that out of the 19. It's pretty terrific wine. I think it's got it all. It just needs a little bit more time to kind of come together.
Allen is a great study in site specificity, right? You have the Allen Vineyard and the Rocchioli Vineyard across the street from each other, both planted by Joe Rocchioli, both planted in the late 60s into the early 70s, and literally across the street, and the flavor profiles couldn't be more different in it.
Yeah.
The big 9-foot row in between rows so they could drive the giant tractors down, everything exactly the same, and the wines are completely different. And you're talking literally a 40 or 50 foot difference between the two vineyards.
And mind you too, the winemaking is identical in these, right? Yeah. So it couldn't be a better comparison in terms of how different the soil, how big of an influence the soil and the local kind of microclimate, how that has an effect on the final product. Yeah.
Yeah. I've always, people talk about regional terroir, and I think, we tend to look at vineyard terroir, right? Because even here at the estate, the grapes at the top of the hill are different from the grapes at the bottom of the hill. And that's partly soil, it's partly the fog will linger in the little patches at the bottom of the hill a little more. So while there definitely is regional terroir as well, I mean, Russian River has a signature to it, but I think when you get into these really well-made vineyard designates, you do see, at literally vineyard or block terroir going on.
Absolutely.
Beautiful wine, Jeff.
Yeah, thank you.
So now going west to a much cooler area out on the Sonoma coast, Precious Mountain Vineyard. Precious Mountain is at the very top of a hillside, and I'm going to guess around 1,800 feet, Jeff. Am I close?
Maybe not that high. 14.
1,400?
Yeah.
Right above, if you've ever heard of Marcus and Blue Slide Ridge, this is the vineyard above. We are the only people who receive the fruit from it, so it's a monopole. Planted by Donnie Schatzberg, who basically was there as part of a hippie commune and stayed on and started developing the land, planting fruit trees and grapevines, literally sometimes 5 or 10 vines a season. I haven't tried the wine yet, so Jeff, why don't you jump in and give us a little descriptor?
It's maybe a tiny little bit more about the vineyard. So some of the very first plantings here go back to 1971. And it's so definitely, these old vines struggling to ripen on this mountaintop. And then as Mark said, each year he would plant a different section. And so even though it's only about a 5-acre vineyard, there are 15 plus different individual vineyard blocks planted at different times over, decades. And different different aspects and different slopes, and it's a really fascinating vineyard. Because of the very low yield there, it's actually a dry, this just always blows me away when I go up there. It's a dry farmed vineyard on top of a mountain. And so we rely on the natural rainfall, which thankfully is kind of significant out on the coast, throughout the winter months. So that kind of is enough to kind of keep the vines sustained. And so dry farming is even possible because of that. But when you definitely put your nose in the glass, you're transported in a totally different place from the Russian River Valley, right? I mean, it's more savory, it's dark fruited. The fruit, there's definitely a concentration to the nose. The color tells you, very small berries struggle to ripen, and then putting it in your mouth. I haven't tasted it yet. Why don't you guys take over while I take a sip here of what you think about the wine?
I was just about to comment on the color too. I was literally just looking down at it, thinking how beautiful the color was, and I love just how, transportive this wine is. I think is a good way to put it. It's the word you used.
this is always a standout in the lineup. There's a finish to this wine and a structure to it that always makes me try to lay them down for generally about as long as the Allen, even though their flavor profiles are completely different. You know, this is a much bigger wine than the Allen. It's and the tannins were like the Allen. You have these silky tannins that I get mostly on the finish. This hits me, the tannin structure here hits me on the front palate and the mid palate really fast. And it's a big wine, but the elegance is still there. A bit darker fruited than the Allen, but just a wonderfully rich wine.
It's definitely a tannin driven complexion on the palate, right? And it definitely tells you you're in a high stress, low yielding, kind of site. It's a fascinating wine. Definitely age, or something robust. If you're going to drink it young, eat it, drink it with something, hearty.
We actually had a great question from Pat that I wanted to pop up on the screen. Jeff, do we use all of the blocks from Precious, or do we pick and choose?
We do. So they all because it's such a small vineyard, and the yield is typically 1 ton to the acre on the 5 acres. That's sort of part of the charm of it. So everything's kind of co-fermented together, and it's even kind of funny because some of the original plants that Donnie had planted in the 70s, experimenting, whatever. Some of the original plants were actually Gewürztraminer. And so on occasion, I'm talking about like 1 or 2 plants, the vine still has energy to push a Gewürztraminer shoot out with like 2 clusters on it. And, it's like, oh, what the heck, throw it in there. And so oftentimes when we're fermenting this tank, I'll see 1 or 2 clusters of Gewürztraminer still floating around in the tank during the fermentation process. And it's kind of funny because sometimes I can smell, and maybe it's more related to the inherent qualities of Pinot Noir and that perfume that we've talked about in other wines. I do get a perfume out of and so my mind always wants to think, oh, is it those 2 Gewürztraminer clusters? But it's probably it's the site, so.
Okay, and we're getting close to the hour mark, so we're going to move on to the Zins. So we're tasting 2 of them today. First one is from the Bacigalupi vineyard, and it's
great nose.
it's right up the road from us. I'd say 2 to 3 miles up the road as you're heading up West Side Road towards Healdsburg. Owned and farmed by the Bacigalupi family. The matriarch of the family, Helen, is still with us in her 90s and still a firecracker. And now the rest of the family is involved, including the twins who are there, Nicole and Katie. And one of our favorite Zinfandel vineyards. And we actually do get a little Pinot Noir from them that goes into our West Side Road neighbors as well.
Yeah.
So why don't you jump into the wine, Jeff? And
so if hopefully most of you are familiar with all the Zinfandels that we make, of which there are 4. 3 of the other Zinfandels tend to have field blended, Carignan or Alicante, intermixed in the field. That's true of Cytone, Pepera, and Finucchi Wood Road. But this one's kind of unique in that it's pure Zinfandel. And so to me, when I smell and taste this wine, there's a purity. This is pure Zinfandel at its best, right, on West Side Road, which is, typically more Chardonnay and Pinot Noir country, but old vines really make the difference here, right? I don't have an exact date on this particular block, but it easily dates back into the 20s and 30s, so arguably old enough, right? 100 year, close to 100-year-old vineyard. But yeah, just that sort of. Oftentimes, I describe it as sort of fruit bowl. There's red, blue, and black fruits kind of intermixed in here. A little bit of what I was going to say, pepper and, fennel and, all sorts of interesting aromas. But there's a real purity of the fruit here, which I just absolutely adore in this wine. Both Zinfandels will have only about 20 to 25% new oak, depending on the vintage, and then older barrels. So I like to use a mix of 1 year, 2 year, and 3 year old barrels. Just Zinfandel has enough structure in and of itself, and it doesn't need a lot more added complexity, if you will, through oak. And it's what a perfect balance, I think, in this wine. Great fruit to structure.
Yeah, the anise notes, or as I think of it, fennel, stand out for me, and it is a beautiful expression of Zinfandel. Just jumping on a question, a couple of real quick questions. Marshall, we did make a 2010 Precious Mountain. We've made one every year since the beginning until 2020. We are not making a Precious Mountain because of the fires were too close there. And then there's a question about alcohol and Zinfandel. So generally, and Jeff can jump in here, the alcohol content in Zinfandel is generally almost always higher than Pinot Noir. Ours tend to be around the high 14s or maybe into the low 15s. And the one thing you should understand is, compared to the Pinot Noir, that's high, but compared to most other California Zins, that's low. Zinfandels are generally, with some exceptions, which I think are good expressions of Zinfandel as well, they tend to be in the high 15s and into the 16s. There are folks that definitely make them in our style now. But so, a 14.8 or a 15.0 alcohol for Zinfandel is not actually very high for a Zin.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I wish I could transport you to a vineyard and look at a Zinfandel cluster. It is one of the goofiest kind of ripening clusters or varieties out there. So if you look at a Zinfandel cluster, which can be in some cases half a pound, they're actually quite large. You look at a cluster and there's pink berries and perfectly ripe berries and maybe even berries that are starting to shrivel up a little bit. It ripens so unevenly, and so if you were to pick it at a very low potential alcohol, say like 12 or 13%, the flavor profile would be so green and vegetative that it would just be undrinkable. So in a lot of ways, you're catering to how the cluster and the variety ripens. And so unfortunately, to get the flavor profile that we're looking at, it requires a little bit more ripeness. And so that translates into a little bit more alcohol. The reason why this wine is, Carly, could you flash up the Bocce product sheet again? So the reason why this wine works, 15% alcohol, and it tastes delicious and balanced. And here's a hallmark of the Russian River Valley, right? You have this nighttime cooling effect from the fog. You got these nice warm days. That pH and acidity and that's finished with malolactic. So, I mean, I don't want to get into too much of the chemistry of everything that's happening, but that's a very low pH and a high acid for a Zinfandel. And so it's, again, going back to how a Zinfandel cluster sort of ripens. If I was picking this at a 13%, like a Pinot Noir sort of potential alcohol, that acid, I mean, it would be like battery acid drinking. You'd have battery acid in your glass, right? It's totally undrinkable. So it's balancing what the grape gives us, balancing the acidity, the fresh fruit flavors, not the vegetative fruit flavors. And that happens at around 14.9 to 15.2 or 15.3, depending on the season. So,
and Jeff, what would be we had a couple questions about the bricks that you're picking out for the Zinfandels.
Yep. So those would be, I start bringing them in around 24 and a half, somewhere in there. So.
Yeah, and battery acid is in your glass is never a good thing.
It's not
I'm
a
just gonna
good
go
thing.
out on a limb.
Don't try that at home.
Yeah.
For sure.
A 2019 Cytona State Zin. So I'm hoping some of you tuned into our deep dive on Cytone. So I won't spend a lot of time on that. But this was a vineyard we bought in 2016, and it was planted in 1895. It's right below the Olivet Lane vineyard on the Olivet Pioneer Corridor, which is technically in Santa Rosa. It's right on the edge of Santa Rosa as you get closer out to Forestville and Healdsburg. Beautiful old vine Zin vineyard. There's an old barn on there that we restored to its kind of the way a farmer would restore a barn back at the turn of the previous century. And we are doing some vineyard tours out there for a different experience if you're ever want to come and don't want to come back to the winery. I mean, or want to do something different from coming to the winery. Who wouldn't want to come back? Come on.
That's right.
And I think the Cytone, with all deference to Bacigalupi and Papera and Finucchi Wood Road, Cytone has quickly become my favorite Zin in our portfolio. It is totally different from the other three Zins, and I find it, it's dense but elegant at the same time, and it's really a standout. And again, I haven't tried it yet tonight, so I'm looking forward to a taste here.
I mean, you put your nose in the glass, definitely, there's incredible concentration that you could really get right off the bat. Dark fruits, but even that sort of red fruited character kind of comes through too, right? I mean, there's, red raspberry kind of notes, and, here's that chemistry again, right? The pH is actually even lower in the Cytone, which is typical for that part of the Russian River Valley. So, and sort of in the context of the wine, the acidity helps balance out that alcohol, which is necessary. If this wine didn't have that sort of acid level, yeah, you would just be tasting tons of alcohol in this wine and structured tannins. Incredible palate, minerality. It's there on the tasting notes. That kind of crushed rock, mineral kind of notes. Yeah, it's kind of a weird comment, but I often use like crunchy red fruits with this. Something that I don't know. I don't even know why I say that, but it has that sort of, to me in my head, it has that sort of descriptor.
It's like when you bite into just a barely underripe like red plum.
Yeah,
that kind of like sensation, I feel like is
for sure.
That's what I picture when you say it, and that's what I get from this wine. I think it's beautiful.
If you haven't tried our Zins, there's the way I have always described it is, if you're used to those Zins that are, black pepper and kind of, I think of it as kind of kick in the head Zins. This is not that. This is elegant red fruited Zinfandel. You're not going to think it's a Pinot Noir for any reason, but it is Zinfandel. But they're prettier wines, and while again 15.1 is not low alcohol, it is lower than a lot of Zins, and they tend to age, I think, more like Cabernet, or I think when Old Bordeaux, when it used to be referred to as Claret. I've had some of these Zins with 20 years. Not all of them will go 20 years, don't get me wrong, but I've had some that have, and they tend to start drinking more like a Cab or a Bordeaux blend in some ways. Not when they're young at all, but when they're young, they're definitely fruity Zins, and they're great with food. You can pair them with, either steak, or I'll sometimes even pair it with Italian food. So they're fabulous wines, and this is another great example of it, Jeff.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we're a bit over on time. Again, thank you for tuning in, whether it's live or if you're watching us after the fact. It's nice to see the comments from so many friends all over the country, and I don't know if we had any international joining us this time, but we appreciate you taking the time and the interest. The main release does open Monday. As you may have noticed, just kind of a word to the wise, we will start selling out on Monday for a couple of the wines. This is out of our control. It has something changed with COVID and people being home. The ordering on Monday is a frenzy. We appreciate the support, but it does mean that some of the wines sell out on the first day, which is it has never happened before until the past year. It doesn't mean we're selling more wine. It just means we're selling it faster. And we can't really control that. So I do think wines like Coastlands and Precious Mountain will be sold out probably by midday. Other wines, Eastside Road Neighbors, Rocchioli should be around for at least a week or two, hopefully. But again, all bets are off in this new reality, and we're learning as we go along. So thank you for tuning in. Carly, Jeff, your insight to these wines is always amazing, and we appreciate it. Stay safe, stay healthy, everybody, and we hope to see you soon here at the winery or out in our travels.
Yeah. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers. That's it.